The red dust of Mars swirled outside the viewport as Major Susan Clark stared at the holographic display. The numbers didn't lie. Humanity had 3 months of supplies left, maybe 4 if they cut rations again. She rubbed her tired eyes and looked around the command center. Tired faces, slumped shoulders, and hollow eyes stared back at her. 10 years of war against the Krell had reduced humanity from billions across dozens of colonies to fewer than 50,000 souls huddled in this last outpost on Mars. "Major, you need to see this," called Alan Garcia, his voice rising above the hum of machinery. The young communications specialist waved her over urgently. Susan crossed the room quickly. "What is it?" "We're picking up a signal. It's not Krell. It's not one of ours either." Alan's fingers flew across the console. "Whatever it is, it's approaching fast." The command center erupted into activity. Colonel Jack Nelson emerged from his office, his weathered face tense. "Do we have visual?" A grainy image appeared on the main screen. A vessel unlike any they had seen before entered orbit around Mars. It was sleek and crystalline, with sections that seemed to shift and change as they watched. "It's slowing down," Alan reported. "And it's broadcasting. In English." The room fell silent as a melodic voice filled the command center. "People of Earth, we are the Arcanians. We come in peace and offer alliance against our shared enemy, the Krell. Please respond." Jack and Susan exchanged looks. In 10 years of fighting the Krell, humanity had never encountered another intelligent species. "It could be a trap," Susan said quietly. Jack nodded. "Could be. But we're out of options." After consulting with what remained of the Colonial Council, Jack accepted the communication request. The main screen flickered, revealing a being that appeared made of translucent crystal. Its form was vaguely humanoid, with faceted surfaces that reflected light in rainbow patterns. "I am Nexus, envoy of the Arcanian Collective," the being said. "The Krell are our ancient enemy. We have monitored your resistance with interest." "Why show up now?" Jack asked. "Earth has fallen. Most of our colonies are gone." The crystalline being's surfaces shifted slightly. "We believe you possess a weapon against the Krell that you have not yet deployed. We can help you access it." "What weapon?" Susan stepped forward. "We've used everything we have." "Not everything," Nexus replied. "Our scans detected a facility beneath the Valles Marineris. It contains technology beyond your current capabilities and life signs in stasis." 2 days later, Susan found herself in a rover traveling across the Martian surface with Jack, Alan, and 2 Arcanian guides. The aliens moved with fluid grace despite Mars' gravity. Susan kept her hand near her sidearm, not yet ready to trust these convenient allies. The entrance to the facility was hidden in a narrow canyon. It took the Arcanians less than an hour to bypass the security systems that had kept the place sealed for decades. "This doesn't make sense," Susan whispered to Jack as they descended in an ancient elevator. "How could we not know about this place?" "Black Ops," Jack replied grimly. "Before the war, Earth governments kept many secrets." The elevator doors opened to reveal a vast underground complex covered in dust. Emergency lighting activated as they moved forward, revealing a logo on the wall, Project Lazarus, beneath the old United Nations Defense Force emblem. They followed the Arcanians through winding corridors until they reached a massive circular chamber. Susan gasped. 50 cylindrical pods lined the walls, frost covering their viewing ports. Alan wiped the frost from the nearest pod and jumped back. "There's someone in here." Susan moved closer. Through the cleared glass, she could see the face of a man, his features perfectly preserved in cryogenic suspension. A display nearby flickered to life as Alan accessed the computer system. "Project Lazarus," Alan read aloud. "Experimental super soldier program. These subjects underwent extensive genetic enhancement, cybernetic augmentation, and neural modification." "Why were they abandoned?" Susan asked. The Arcanian named Nexus turned to her, its crystalline form catching the dim light. "They were not abandoned. They were hidden. Your leaders feared them. We do not. And now, they are humanity's last hope. Susan pressed her hand against the cold surface of the cryogenic pod. The man inside looked peaceful, as if he were merely sleeping instead of being frozen for over 40 years. The display next to the pod identified him as Commander Peter Walsh, age 35 at time of freezing. "Can we wake them?" Jack asked, turning to the Arcanians. Nexus moved to a central console, crystal fingers gliding over the dusty controls. "Your technology is primitive but functional. However, revival after such extended cryostasis carries significant risks. We can improve the process with our medical knowledge." Alan had accessed a terminal and was scrolling through classified files. His eyes widened as he read. "Sir, you need to see this. These soldiers, they weren't just trained. They were transformed." Susan moved to look over his shoulder. The documents detailed extensive modifications: enhanced muscle density, reinforced skeletal structure, accelerated healing, and neural implants that increased reaction time and tactical processing. "Why would they be hidden away?" Susan asked. Alan continued reading. According to this, Project Lazarus was deemed too ethically problematic by the United Nations Security Council. The subjects showed aggressive tendencies and psychological instability. Instead of terminating the project entirely, they decided to place the soldiers in cryostasis until, he paused, until a time of dire need. Jack laughed bitterly. "Well, I'd say extinction qualifies as dire need." The second Arcanian, who had introduced itself as Vex, approached them. Unlike Nexus, whose crystal form was blue-tinged, Vex had a greenish hue. "The Krell conquered our homeworld 3 centuries ago. We understand extinction's threat. These warriors may save both our species." Susan felt uneasy. If they were considered too dangerous by our own leaders, how can we control them? "We don't need to control them," Jack replied firmly. "We need to point them at the Krell." After hours of careful preparation, the Arcanians connected their technology to the cryogenic systems. Medical Officer Diane Foster, who had joined them from the colony, monitored the process with fascination. "The cellular damage from long-term freezing should be extensive," she told Susan, "but the Arcanian regenerative field is repairing it as they warm. It's incredible." The pod containing Commander Walsh hissed as it began its revival sequence. Everyone stepped back as the lid slowly opened, releasing a cloud of cold vapor. For several tense moments, nothing happened. Then, a sharp gasp broke the silence. The man's eyes snapped open, ice blue and immediately alert. In one fluid motion, he lunged from the pod, grabbing Nexus by what approximated a throat and pinning the crystalline being against the wall. "Who are you?" Walsh demanded, his voice hoarse from decades of disuse. "Where am I?" "Stand down, Commander." Jack used his most authoritative voice. "We're all on the same side here." Walsh turned to look at the humans, keeping Nexus firmly in his grip. Susan was struck by how quickly he moved despite just awakening from cryosleep. The man was tall, with military short hair now grown out slightly during his long sleep, and muscles that remained defined after decades of inactivity. "Identify yourself," Walsh said to Jack. "Colonel Jack Nelson, Mars Colony Command." "This is Major Susan Clark, my second." Walsh's eyes narrowed. "Mars Colony. What year is it?" Alan answered nervously. 2187. "Sir." Walsh slowly released Nexus, shock evident on his face. "We went under in 2145. "Commander," Susan said gently, "Earth has fallen. We're humanity's last outpost, and we're losing the war against an alien race called the Krell." Walsh's expression hardened as he processed this information. "My team." "Still in stasis," Diane answered. "You're the first we've revived." Walsh straightened his shoulders, military training visibly taking over despite his disorientation. "Wake them up. All of them." He looked at the Arcanians with distrust. "And then you're going to tell me everything about these Krell, and why I shouldn't consider you enemies too. Nexus's crystalline form pulsed with light. Because, Commander, you were created to fight an enemy exactly like the Krell. Your enhancements were designed specifically for this war. A war your creators foresaw, but did not live to fight. Over the next 24 hours, the team worked to revive the remaining super soldiers. Each awakening was different. Some soldiers came to consciousness calmly, while others emerged fighting. One by one, Commander Walsh spoke to each of them, explaining their new reality. Lieutenant Kate Rivers was the tactical specialist. She was shorter than most of her teammates, but moved with deadly precision. Her dark eyes missed nothing as she paced the facility, memorizing every exit and entry point. "I don't trust them," she whispered to Walsh, nodding toward the Arcanians. They stood across the room, their crystalline bodies glimmering under the lights. "Neither do I," Walsh replied. "But we need information, and they seem to have it." Sergeant Ben Mitchell was the team's weapons expert. His large hands seemed restless without a gun. 40 years in the freezer," he grumbled. "Feels like yesterday we went under." The last soldier to awaken was Frank Hill, the team's demolition specialist. Unlike the others, he woke screaming. It took both Walsh and Mitchell to hold him down while Diane injected him with a sedative. "The neural implants," Diane explained to Susan. "They're causing feedback loops in some of their brains. Their enhancements were experimental at best." Susan watched as Frank finally calmed down, his eyes focusing. "Will they all be stable enough to fight?" Diane shrugged. "Honestly, I don't know. These people were modified beyond what should be possible. Their muscle density is twice normal. Their reaction times are off the charts. But psychologically, they're walking time bombs." While the medical team worked with the newly awakened soldiers, Susan joined Jack and Walsh in what had become their planning room. The Arcanians had provided holographic displays of Krell ships and ground forces. "Their biology is insect-like," Nexus explained, pointing to an image of a Krell warrior. The creature had multiple limbs, a hard exoskeleton, and compound eyes, but they operate with a hive mind. Cut off the Queen's signal, and the drones become disorganized. "We've never been able to get close enough to their command ships," Jack said. "Our conventional forces are outgunned and outmanned." Walsh studied the images carefully. "What makes you think we can do what your regular troops can't?" Vex stepped forward. "Your neural implants. They operate on frequencies similar to the Krell communication network. With modifications, you might be able to disrupt their signals." The door opened, and Kate walked in with another soldier. "Commander, Lisa Ward has something to report." Lisa was the team's communications expert. Her eyes were bloodshot from reviewing the colony's records of Krell transmissions. "I've been analyzing their communication patterns. There's something odd about them." She touched a control panel, and a sound filled the room. It was a high-pitched series of clicks and whines that made Susan wince. "This is a standard Krell battle communication," Lisa explained. But underneath it, she adjusted the frequencies, and a different sound emerged, almost like a moan. "What is that?" Jack asked. "Pain," Lisa said simply. "Whatever these Krell are, I think they're suffering." The room fell silent as they considered this. Kate's suspicious gaze fell on the Arcanians. "You said they're your ancient enemy. What exactly is your history with them?" Nexus and Vex exchanged looks that Susan couldn't interpret. "It is complicated," Nexus said finally. "Uncomplicated?" Walsh demanded. Vex's crystalline form dimmed slightly. "The Krell and Arcanians evolved on neighboring worlds. We were peaceful traders once. Then something changed them. They became aggressive, expanding rapidly. Our scientists believe they were infected by a parasitic intelligence." "Infected?" Diane had entered the room quietly. "You mean they're not in control of themselves?" "That is our theory," Nexus replied. "But in 40 years of fighting, we've never captured a live specimen to confirm it." Walsh looked at his team members scattered around the room, then back at the holographic Krell. "Well," he said with a grim smile, I think it's time we caught one and found out. The training room echoed with the sound of gunfire as the super soldiers tested their skills with modern weapons. Despite 40 years in cryosleep, they adapted quickly. Susan watched from an observation deck as Walsh directed his team through combat drills. "They're impressive," Jack said, joining her. "I've never seen anyone move that fast." Susan nodded. "But can we trust them?" Even Walsh admits they were frozen because they were unstable. Below, Kate Rivers hit 20 moving targets in less than 15 seconds, her movements a blur. Beside her, Ben Mitchell lifted a weapons rack that would normally require 3 men to move. "We don't have the luxury of trust," Jack replied. "The Krell fleet will reach Mars in 3 weeks. It's them or extinction." Later that day, Susan found Kate in the mess hall, sitting alone. The other colonists gave the super soldiers a wide berth, equal parts awe and fear in their eyes. "Mind if I join you?" Susan asked. Kate gestured to the empty seat. "Your people are afraid of us." "Can you blame them? You're literally superhuman." Kate's mouth twisted in what might have been a smile. "We didn't ask to be made this way. One day we were regular soldiers. The next we were lab rats." She pushed her food around on her plate. "And now everyone we knew is dead." Susan hadn't considered how it must feel to wake up in a different century, with your entire world gone. "I'm sorry." "Don't be. At least we get to fight." Kate looked up. "That's all we were ever good for anyway." On the other side of the facility, Walsh met with Vex. Unlike Nexus, who maintained formal distance, Vex seemed genuinely interested in humans. "Your modifications are remarkable," Vex said, studying the readouts from Walsh's latest physical. "Your creators achieved through mechanical means what our species evolved naturally." "What do you mean?" Walsh asked. Vex's crystalline body shifted, parts becoming transparent to reveal internal structures. "Like you, we were changed. Our ancestors were organic, but they developed crystal implants to survive radiation on our homeworld. Over generations, the crystal replaced more tissue until we became as you see us now." Walsh considered this. "So you were human once, or human-like?" "Organic," Vex corrected. "But yes, more like you than the Krell." Their conversation was interrupted when alarms blared throughout the facility. They rushed to the command center where Alan frantically worked at his console. "Krell scout ship," he reported. "They've detected activity at this facility." "How?" Jack demanded. "This place was hidden for decades." Nexus moved forward. "The revival process required energy surges. They must have detected the power signature." "How long until they report back to their fleet?" Walsh asked. "They already have," Alan said grimly. "But there's more. They've landed a scouting party 10 kilometers from here and closing fast." Walsh turned to his team who had assembled at the sound of the alarm. "Looks like we're getting a field test sooner than expected." He looked at Kate, Rivers, Mitchell, Hill, Ward. "Gear up. We're going hunting." Susan stepped forward. "I should come too. I know the terrain." Walsh studied her for a moment, then nodded. "Stay close to Rivers. Do exactly what she says." 30 minutes later, they waited in a narrow canyon, the red Martian landscape stretching around them. Each super soldier was equipped with the colony's best weapons and armor, though they looked too small on their enhanced frames. "Movement," Kate whispered, her enhanced vision picking up what the others couldn't yet see. 6 Krell scouts, moving in standard search pattern. Susan peered through binoculars. The Krell were larger than she expected, standing over 7 feet tall on 4 rear legs, with 2 smaller limbs extending from their upper torsos. Their carapaces gleamed dully in the Martian sun. Walsh's voice came through their comm links. "Remember the plan. We need one alive." Ben checked his rifle. "And the others?" "The others," Walsh said coldly, "are target practice. Show me what you can do." Susan felt a chill that had nothing to do with the Martian atmosphere. As the Krell drew closer, she watched the super soldiers tense like predators about to pounce. For the first time since the war began, she felt something she'd almost forgotten. Hope. The Krell moved with surprising grace despite their bulky forms. Susan held her breath as they drew closer to the ambush point. Next to her, Kate was completely still, only her eyes moving as she tracked the aliens. Walsh's voice came soft through the comlink. On my mark. 3, 2, 1. Mark. The world exploded into action. Ben and Frank opened fire from opposite sides of the canyon, their shots precisely aimed at the 5 Krell they planned to eliminate. Kate lunged forward with inhuman speed, heading for the 6th Krell that was their capture target. Susan had seen combat against the Krell before, but never like this. The super soldiers moved like dancers, each motion fluid and deadly. The Krell fired back with their energy weapons, but the soldiers seemed to anticipate each shot, moving just before the trigger was pulled. Within seconds, 4 Krell lay dead. The 5th turned to flee, but Frank threw a small device that attached to its back. The device beeped once, then sent an electrical pulse through the alien. It dropped, twitching. Nice toy, Susan said. Frank grinned. Made it this morning. Figured their nervous systems would respond to electricity like most species. Kate was locked in close combat with the final Krell. Despite the alien size advantage, she moved around it too quickly for it to land a blow. Walsh joined her, and together they forced the creature to the ground. Then approached with restraints specially designed for the Krell's 6 limbs. Careful, Walsh warned as the Krell thrashed. Don't damage it. Once the creature was secured, Susan approached. Up close, the Krell was even more intimidating. Its compound eyes reflected her image back in multiple facets. Strange clicks and whines came from its mouth parts. It's communicating, Lisa said, recording the sounds. Probably calling for help. Can we block the signal? Susan asked. Lisa nodded. Already done. I'm running it through a jammer. As they prepared to transport their prisoner back to the facility, Frank called out from where he was examining the dead Krell. Commander, you should see this. Walsh joined him, kneeling beside the alien corpse. Frank pointed to something embedded in the back of the Krell's neck, just beneath the exoskeleton. It was a small, pulsing device. Is that technology? Walsh asked. Looks like it, Frank replied. And it's not part of their natural biology. Someone put this here. Before they could examine it further, Susan's scanner beeped. More Krell signatures, a full patrol this time. We need to move. They retreated to their rover with the captured Krell secured in a containment unit. As they drove back to the facility, Susan noticed Kate staring at the prisoner with an intensity that seemed unusual even for her. What is it? Susan asked. Its eyes, Kate replied quietly. There's intelligence there. And something else. What? Fear. Back at the facility, they transferred the Krell to a reinforced holding cell. Diane and the Arcanian scientists prepared to examine it, setting up equipment to scan its biology and attempt to decode its communication. Jack met them in the corridor outside the lab. How did it go? Better than expected, Walsh replied. These Krell aren't as tough as we thought. Not for my team. Susan pulled Jack aside. We found something strange. The Krell have devices implanted in them, like some kind of tech. Jack frowned. Show me. Inside the lab, Frank had removed one of the devices from a dead Krell. It sat on a tray, still pulsing faintly with a greenish light. When Nexus entered the room and saw it, the Arcanian stopped abruptly. Where did you get that? Nexus asked, its voice different than before. From the Krell, Walsh said. You didn't tell us they had implants. We did not know, Nexus replied, but Susan noticed Vex shift uncomfortably. Lisa, who had been analyzing the Krell's sounds, suddenly looked up from her workstation. I've isolated a pattern in their communication. It's not random noise. She pressed a button, and a series of sounds played through the speakers. If I filter out the clicking and run it through our translation matrix, a voice emerged from the speakers. It was distorted but clearly understandable. Help us. They control us. Help us. The room fell silent after Lisa's translation played. Everyone stared at the captive Krell, seeing it with new eyes. Help us. They control us. The words hung in the air like a fog. Walsh turned to Nexus, his face hard. You knew about this, didn't you? The crystalline being's form flickered. Commander Walsh, I assure you, don't lie to me. Walsh stepped closer to the Arcanian. The implants. The control. You knew. Before Nexus could respond, Vex moved between them. He knew. We all knew. The green-tinged Arcanian's voice was steady. But it isn't what you think. Susan looked from the Arcanians to the Krell. Then what is it? Tell us the truth this time. Vex's crystalline body dimmed. The Krell and Arcanians are related species. We evolved on twin planets in the same system. For millennia, we lived in peace. What changed? Jack asked. We did, Nexus admitted reluctantly. Our scientists developed a method to enhance our crystalline properties. It allowed us to live longer, think faster. But we needed a rare mineral to continue the process. Let me guess, Kate said coldly. The Krell had it on their planet. Vex nodded. We tried to trade. When they refused, some among us took more direct measures. The implants were designed to make the Krell mine the mineral for us. You enslaved them, Susan said, disgusted. Only some of us agreed to this path, Vex insisted. There was a split in our society. Those who supported the enslavement became the ruling class. Those who opposed it were exiled or forced to comply. Walsh's expression was thunderous. So you came to us for help defeating your own slaves who broke free. You're not allies. You're slave masters looking for someone to do your dirty work. It's more complicated than that, Nexus said. Yes, the implants were originally for control. But something went wrong. The control signal mutated. It turned the Krell from obedient workers into a hive of killers. Ben Mitchell, who had been examining one of the implants, looked up. He's telling the truth about that part. This tech is designed to amplify aggression. It's similar to our neural implants, but cruder. Lisa continued to work at her station. I'm getting more translated phrases. The Krell are saying, the signal burns. Cannot resist. Must obey. Diane approached the captive Krell carefully. Can we remove the implants? No, Nexus said quickly. Removal is fatal to them now. The devices are integrated with their nervous systems. But we could disrupt the control signal, Vex suggested. If we could analyze how your neural implants interact with the Krell technology, we might create a counter-signal. Jack and Susan exchanged glances. Give us the room, Jack said. The Arcanians hesitated, then left. Jack turned to Walsh. What do you think? I think we've been played, Walsh replied. But that doesn't change our situation. The Krell are still coming to wipe us out, controlled or not. Susan looked at the captive Krell, feeling a mix of pity and fear. If they're being controlled, they're victims too. That doesn't make them less dangerous, Kate pointed out. An alarm suddenly blared through the facility. Alan's voice came over the comm system. Multiple contacts. Arcanian ships dropping out of faster-than-light travel. They're surrounding the planet. They rushed to the command center. The main display showed dozens of crystalline ships taking position around Mars. What is this? Jack demanded when Nexus and Vex arrived. The Arcanian High Command, Nexus said, sounding surprised. They weren't supposed to arrive for another week. A new voice spoke through the comm system. Nexus, you have failed to secure the human weapon as ordered. We are taking control of this operation. Walsh grabbed Nexus. What weapon? What are they talking about? Vex stepped forward. You. The super soldiers. You were never meant to fight the Krell. The High Command wants your neural technology to improve their control over the Krell. And the Mars colony. Susan asked, already knowing the answer. Expendable, Vex said softly, once they have what they need. The first explosions shook the facility as the Arcanian fleet opened fire on the Mars defense satellites. Jack looked at Walsh, both men understanding what needed to be done. Looks like we're fighting a two-front war now, Walsh said grimly. The underground facility shook as another explosion hit the surface. Dust fell from the ceiling as Susan, Jack, Walsh, and the others raced to form a plan. The colony shields won't last long against that fleet, Alan reported, his fingers flying over the controls. We need to evacuate the civilians, Susan insisted. Jack nodded. The emergency bunkers in Valles Marineris should hold them. But we need time. Walsh looked at his team of super soldiers. Time is what we'll give you. He turned to Vex. You said you oppose what your leaders are doing. Prove it. Help us. Vex's crystalline form brightened. There is a way. The Arcanian ships share a central command frequency. If we could broadcast a disruption signal on that frequency, it might disable their weapons temporarily. Like what we planned for the Krell, Lisa said, understanding. Exactly, Vex replied. Your neural implants operate on frequencies that could interfere with both Krell and Arcanian systems. Ven examined the implant they had recovered. We could modify this to broadcast our countersignal. But we'd need to get it to the Arcanian command ship. How? Susan asked. We can't fly anything through that fleet. Kate had been quiet, studying the tactical display. Now she pointed to a small ship docked at the facility. That's the vessel Nexus and Vex arrived in. Would it let us approach without raising alarms? Nexus, who had been secured but was listening, nodded reluctantly. Yes, it would be recognized as friendly. Then we have our plan, Walsh said. Kate, Ben, Frank, and I will take the Arcanian ship to deliver the countersignal. Susan, you and Jack evacuate the colony. What about the Krell? Diane asked. They're still coming. Lisa looked up from her workstation. Maybe not as enemies. If we broadcast the right signal, we might free them from control. Walsh checked his weapon. Worth a shot. He turned to his team. Gear up. We launch in 10 minutes. As the super soldiers prepared for their mission, Susan approached Walsh. This is a one-way trip. You know that, right? Walsh smiled slightly. We were dead already, Major. Frozen for 40 years. This is borrowed time. He looked at his team. Besides, this is what we were made for. Fighting aliens. No, Walsh said quietly. Saving humanity when no one else could. The Arcanian ship rose from the facility as explosions continued to rock the surface of Mars. Inside, Walsh, Kate, Ben, and Frank prepared for battle, while Vex piloted them toward the Arcanian fleet. Lisa's voice came through their comms as she guided them remotely. The counter-signal is ready, she said. Once you're in range of the command ship, activate it. It should disrupt both the Krell control signal and the Arcanian weapon systems. And then, Kate asked. And then you convince them to stop, one way or another, Lisa replied. The small ship approached the massive Arcanian command vessel, passing unchallenged through the fleet. On the surface below, Susan and Jack led the evacuation, rushing colonists to the emergency bunkers as Arcanian weapons fire rained down. Inside the command ship, Walsh and his team fought their way to the central control room. The Arcanians, despite their crystalline bodies, proved vulnerable to the specialized weapons Ben had designed. Room by room, they advanced. Almost there, Vex said as they reached the final corridor. The command center is ahead. Suddenly, alerts blared throughout the ship. Krell vessels detected. A voice announced, "Prepare for engagement." "The Krell fleet," Kate said. "They're here early." Walsh looked at the tactical display. Dozens of Krell ships had appeared, surrounding the Arcanian fleet. "Perfect timing," he said with a grim smile. "Let's end this." They burst into the command center, quickly subduing the Arcanian leaders. Ben connected their modified implant to the ship's communication array, while Frank and Kate secured the room. Walsh approached the Arcanian High Commander, a larger crystalline being seated on a raised platform. "This ends now," Walsh said. "You're going to call off your attack on Mars." "Or what, human?" the commander asked. "The Krell will destroy us all anyway." "Maybe not," Walsh replied. "Ben, activate the counter signal." Ben pressed a sequence of controls. A high-pitched tone filled the air, then faded to a frequency only the Arcanians could hear. The effect was immediate. Throughout the ship, Arcanians froze as their systems were disrupted. On the tactical display, they watched as the Krell ships also faltered, their movements becoming erratic. "It's working," Vex said in amazement. "The control signal is breaking down." Lisa's voice came through their comms. "All Krell communications have changed frequency. They're talking to each other, not fighting." The Arcanian commander stared at Walsh. "What have you done?" "Freed them," Walsh replied. "And now you're going to negotiate peace or face them on equal terms without your control technology." 3 days later, Susan stood with Jack on the surface of Mars, watching as representatives from the Krell, the reformed Arcanian government led by Vex, and humanity signed the first interspecies peace treaty in human history. "I never thought I'd see this," Jack said quietly. "Neither did I," Susan replied. She looked over to where Walsh and his team stood at attention. "Their mission complete. What happens to them now?" "That's up to them," Jack said. "But something tells me humanity will always need its super soldiers, even in peacetime." Walsh caught Susan's eye and nodded. For the first time since his awakening, he smiled. A real smile that reached his eyes. The war that seemed lost had been won, not just for humanity, but for all 3 species.